All right, thanks for coming to the project update. My name is Lance. I'm the current Keystone PTL. I'm joined by Christy, who is a member of our Keystone core team. And today we're going to give you the Queens project update.
So first, I'll start with what is OpenStack Identity. You probably know since you're here, but I'll spend 1 minute to do a brief overview. So OpenStack Identity is a shared service between a shared service for authentication, in other words, verifying a user's identity, and authorization, or verifying that a user is permitted to do a specific action. The OpenStack Identity Services supplies identity and service information to end users and services, and it's one of the fundamental building blocks of OpenStack, and is therefore one of the requirements for any OpenStack service to have basic support for OpenStack Identity. It can also act as a broker between OpenStack and other identity services. So if, for example, you have an external identity management solution, you can tie that in either through standard federation protocols or through other mechanisms such as LDAP. The reference implementation is called Keystone and is managed by the Keystone project team, and it has a 98% adoption rate as of the April user survey. So now I'll go through what was accomplished in Keystone during the Pike cycle, which was released in February, right? So first, if you woke up to find that the policy.json file was magically emptied, don't be scared. All the default rules have been moved into code. So now all that's left for the policy.json to manage is the rules which you override. If you need to regenerate the sample policy.json file, you can do so from the command line. Next, we've improved the documentation. So now you don't have to go hunting around between the user guide, the developer's guide, the install guide, the admin guide. They're all in one place under the Keystone team and managed by the Keystone team under the guidance of the documentations team. This allowed us to do some long-needed deduplication and removal of stale information, which had crept into all those different guides. We've also introduced rolling upgrade testing. So this brings us one step closer to saying that we fully support rolling upgrades. All that's left is a minor test case, which we do not cover with regards to stable branches. So what are we achieving in this cycle, which is the Queens cycle? First, the one strikes at everyone. It's very big. We finally removed the V2 API. It's been a long time coming and underwent a long deprecation cycle. We got a sign-off from the TC to remove it from this cycle. So you shouldn't be impacted by this because we have been warning about this for a long time. But if you are, please come talk to us and we'll help you move forward to using the V3 API. And project tags. So now you can assign a list of strings to a project. So you can categorize them via tags. The types of characters and the number of characters and the list of tags is standard between OpenStack projects such as Nova and Cinder. So you can consistently tag things. This allows, for example, if you have a number of class projects for the semester coming up, you can tag all of them with Spring 2018, for example, and when the semester comes to a close, you can just decommission all the projects together instead of having to rely on a separate store for maintaining the collection of these projects. And you can search and list and filter projects based on these tags. Unified limits. So we're providing a mechanism for services to store limit information for resources and projects into Keystone. This would allow for a consistent and standard way for services to do such thing in preparation for hierarchical quotas, because only Keystone really knows the hierarchical information, and consuming that is pretty complicated. So by providing a way for limits to be stored in Keystone, we also provide a way for a path forward for moving towards with hierarchical quotas rather than having projects roll their own solution.
So one of the other big changes we want to make this release is introducing something called system scope. And it's kind of like project scope tokens, but for a different context. and this is really a culmination of a year's worth of policy and RBAC discussions across OpenStack. During the PTG, we came together with all those discussions and those conclusions, and what we came out with was a roadmap for fixing some of the adminness issues that we have today. So the first step in that roadmap for Keystone is teaching Keystone about a new type of scope that handles system-level operations. Going hand in hand with scope and RBAC, we're going to be making a couple of improvements to the Oslo policy library. The first is being able to deprecate policies like you would deprecate configuration options. So for developers, being able to wrap and flag a policy for removal and then having warnings emitted for operators saying that that policy is going to be removed or it's changing its default. The second thing that we want to do is associate scope types to policies or policy objects. And this is really the other half of the system scoping work that I mentioned in the previous roadmap for system scoping. But both of these things require that policies move, or projects move their default policies into code. And that's been an accepted community-wide goal for Queens. And that's another thing that our team has really been helping with, is making sure projects kind of have the right implementation going forward and registering their defaults in code. This makes things easier for operators because they don't have to define all of their policies, and they also don't have to manually diff policy files across releases, and they can consume policy changes in a programmatic way like they would with configuration options. So traditionally, this tooling has never really existed for policy type changes, so that's going to be a big improvement for us moving forward. So application credentials, more formally known as API keys, was something that we wanted to do for Pike. After we merged the specification and targeted for the Pike release, we hit a few security concerns. And so we tabled the discussion, we brought it to the PTG, and we kind of aired out the last few concerns that we had with it. So we have a couple of developers that are going to be focused on documenting that new direction and then picking up that implementation for the Queens release. And then last but not least, our community is always great about being inclusive and bringing new people on board. But that's something we really want to make a priority for Queens because, like last release, we lost about 75% of our contributor base, which is why you see a lot of the same topics from our Queens or our Pike schedule on our Queens schedule. So that's going to be something that we're really looking forward to. We did already have our project onboarding. That was on Monday. But if any of these topics interest you, or if you know somebody that's got background in it and would be interested in working on some of this stuff, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to get them contributing in any way possible. So let's look ahead to the Rocky release. This is really like a list of things we wanted to continue doing for Queens, but given bandwidth and contributors, we're kind of staging them for Rocky. First on that list is implementing a JWT token provider. If you're unfamiliar with JSON Web Tokens or JWT, it's based on an open standard, specifically RFC 7519. And there's existing Python libraries that implement it. So we'd be consuming it and implementing it in the very same way that we kind of do with Fernet today. The idea is very similar to Fernet in that it gives us a way to issue non-persistent tokens. The only reason why we did not go with JWT back in Kilo when we implemented the Fernet token provider is that the specification for JWT was released 3 months after we implemented Fernet. Otherwise, it would have made sense to just do it right from the get-go. The good thing is that we'll actually be able to reuse a lot of the Fernet bits, both in Keystone and the stuff that we had to do across OpenStack to make that something that we could implement and switch to by default. When we originally wrote that implementation, we kept the encryption mechanism decoupled from the thing that packs the payload. So being able to just pass that to a library that understands JWT instead of something that understands Fernet gets us really close to having a JWT token provider. One big difference in the implementation between the two is that JWT uses asymmetric encryption, Fernet uses symmetric. So from a key repository management perspective, that's going to be important for operators because instead of copying around a key repository of private keys to all your Keystone nodes and so that they can understand each other's tokens, you only have to share the public keys, which is a better security model anyway. So that'll be a big win with JWT. And that kind of leads me into the next topic, which is the removal of the UUID token provider and the persistent token storage layer. The only really good reasons we have for keeping these around is that it offered a backup in the event that there was ever a security issue in the Fernet specification or the Fernet implementation that Keystone consumes itself. So we've wanted to try and help maintain that specification of Fernet. We've had varying luck with that, but moving towards something that's already based on an open standard, like JWT, it has an RFC, it has a community built up around it, it's being used in other communities, kind of mitigates that concern. We can implement JWT and fall back on Fernet in the case that there's ever a security issue, and vice versa. So with that, we actually have the ability to remove the UUID token provider, the persistent token storage layer, and it gives us an opportunity to clean up a ton of technical debt in our token provider API, which is a good thing because traditionally that's the most complicated subsystem of Keystone, and being able to simplify that is going to make things a lot easier for developers joining the project and being able to understand one of OpenStack's most used APIs. With the Oslo policy improvements that we want to make, we're going to have all the tools required to start moving toward a set of well-defined roles by default. Right now in OpenStack, you have admin that can do everything everywhere and everyone else out of the box, and that's kind of suboptimal. We can do better than that, and with the tools that we'll have in place that we're implementing in Queens, we'll be able to start sitting down as a group of services or a platform and start grouping like permissions together and then associating those a sane default and then moving towards that default. That's going to really help with usability and just being able to have something that's reliably consistent across deployments. That way operators don't have to just roll their own custom policies to get something relatively secure in their deployment. Then building on the implementation of system scope, Keystone's really just an information point. We're just emitting this stuff and it's going to be ultimately consumed at the service, especially since policy enforcement is enforced at the service at Nova, Cinder, Neutron, Glance. We need to make ourselves available to those projects if they need help understanding what that means and how that affects their APIs. And that's pretty much the same that's going to go for the hierarchical quota stuff. If we're going to keep unified limit information in Keystone and emit that in a tree structure to a project to consume or a service to consume, we need to make sure that we're available when they want to go implement that, and we're helping them understand what that means and how it affects their project. And then that last bit there, the enforcement models. When we're kind of talking about the implementation of how this all works, specifically within unified limits, and you think about projects as like a tree structure, it's easy to think about how you can change a limit within that structure and then have that affect quotas of the children or the peers or the parents in different ways. And it's not that there's one way that's right and everything else is wrong. It's just that there's probably going to be deployments that want to go with a specific model, and that's okay. But if this information is coming from Keystone, we need to be actively involved in those discussions with the broader community so that we are helping with that enforcement and then encapsulating that in consumable libraries for other services. So that kind of wraps up our project update. We do have plenty of time for questions. And if you do have a question, yep.
So, what's the status of the latest discussions on user-defined policies and more granular policies where maybe I can say, even using user can create great conditions or computing systems with this ID or these tags, as opposed to just saying they have access to all the computing sections?
Sure. So the question was, how does the stuff that we're working on today kind of get us towards more fine-grained policies, as in something like you would see with AWS, right? Yeah, that's a good question. Right now, OpenStack is light years away from something like that. But what we're going to be doing with system-level scoping and kind of the separation of project-level APIs versus system-level APIs, and what I mean by that is booting an instance. When you boot an instance, that instance needs to live in a project, right? It makes sense. But when you modify a service catalog, that's kind of something that affects your entire deployment. Right now, we have no real way to separate those. Like, they're both considered the same thing from like a project scope token perspective. So separating that out into two distinct things where people who have a role on the system can modify your service catalog or roll out new services. People who have roles on projects can create instances, they can create storage devices, they can attach things, right? Separating those is kind of like our first step. And then we fix the adminness issues that we have today, where if I give you the admin role on a project, you can now modify the the service catalog, right? Like that's something that shouldn't happen. So if we get to that point, policy itself is going to be in a lot better place. But we also have things in the works that kind of help build on Oslo Policy's HTTP check, which is kind of like a pass-through where you can set up an external policy enforcement point that returns a yay or a nay on whether or not something is allowed based on the target information, the credentials of that request and the request itself. So my point is that cleaning up a lot of that cruft around our existing policy enforcement across the various services and making sure that we're marshaling consistent data through that HTTP check is going to put us in a place where you could actually roll out a service to do that fine-grained stuff. But we need to be consistent in what we're passing along to the HTTP check endpoint. Right now, there's different services that put different information in there. So as somebody maintaining that policy service, it's very hard, or even a user, right? Like if you're writing your own policies, you don't know what that other service is going to be emitting through until you write a policy and you test it and you realize that it doesn't work. So if we can start standardizing on, even if it's like a super like limited subset of things, of attributes about the resource and attributes about the user, then we can at least say, like, okay, well, here's the things that you can start building on if you want to write your own fine-grained policies, right? It's getting us there. We are going to be going over the roadmap that we have for like the administ issue. That session is going to be at 11 o'clock. Please come by because we're going to be eventually getting into this discussions about how do we get to something that's a little bit more evolved than that. And naturally, the discussion is going to go towards the AWS use cases, you know. But yeah, great question.
Could you talk a bit about how the application credentials will be implemented?
Yeah, so the question was, can you talk a little bit about how application credentials are going to be implemented? When we originally started the API key discussion, the thing that we were really solving for was if we're all on a team of developers and we're maintaining an application that's built on top of OpenStack, and I leave the team, but I set everything up in my user account, now my user is deleted, our whole application breaks, right? So that's the main case that we're solving for with application credentials. It's going to use the same, like the scoping mechanism, like in OpenStack, where like if you think about an API key from Google, right? You copy it out of Google and it's the thing that you authenticate with. Application credentials are actually going to be scoped to a role or multiple roles, but those roles can't exceed the user that's creating it, right? Application credentials in some cases are also going to be limited in certain operations they can do. So for a general user case, then you might not be able to create an application credential with an application credential scope token. That sounded really wordy, but that's kind of like a direction in where we're heading with the implementation.
And does this include the problem of getting credentials onto a new booted instance?
Yeah.
So it's like feed data.
Yeah, it's something you can create and then you can put that in and figure it and then
The Heat folks have a lot of interest around that too.
Yeah.
So they're actively involved in those discussions, and we've been on a consistent touch point with them at the PTG and here, making sure that we're addressing that case. Anything else?
Can you tell me about the migration path from the old policy.json method to the new policies? Is there any way to verify integrity of that migration so that not accidentally
Yeah, and the question was, what's the roadmap going to look like when you start wanting to go from the policy mechanism that we have today towards the thing that we're moving to? And it's going to be kind of complicated because we're introducing new scope. But
does policy.json stop working in Pike, or are both methods similar?
no, so if you define a policy in your policy.yaml or policy.json, it's considered an override. So it's like a default configuration, right? If you specify it in your config, that's the thing that gets used in your deployment. So if you have custom policies that you've written that work for your deployment, then you can continue to use those moving forward. The improvements that we'll be making to the Oslo policy library as far as deprecations are concerned and scope types are going to be backwards compatible. So if you want to stay with the model that exists today, where we have some of the complications with scoping and whatnot, you can. But starting with Rocky, pending the work that we have here gets done, deployments that choose to use this new model where they want to go through and audit their users and people that need to do stuff on the actual system and grant them a system role and then teach those users. That's the other thing in the migration is you need to go through like an educational session with your user base saying, yep, you're modifying the service catalog, so you need to actually get a system scope token, not a project scope token. And the same thing is going to be true for people that were admins on the project. You know, they're going to see less, but for the right reasons. Hopefully that answers your question. And this here is kind of like a roadmap that we came up with out of the PTG. This is the feedback session we're going to be kind of going through at 11 o'clock. We want to go through each of these cards and kind of talk about it with operators and see what kind of snags that they might hit as a result of this. But yeah, publicly available, and would love to get your feedback and comments on it. We also have an Etherpad too.
So historically, there's been quite an issue with Keystone adding new features and the service team struggling to keep up with that stuff. I know you talked a lot in the presentation about making the team available for this, like to help the project teams keep up. At least with the major projects like Nova, Neutron, Swift, Glance, how far behind are they in adopting some of the new stuff that Keystone is kind of building out? I mean, for ages we've had things like you mentioned, the adminness issue when you kind of give someone an admin role within Nova and they can do absolutely anything. So
Sure. The question was, how are we going to help project teams consume these changes? I think we can document how it works and like, yeah, this is a new thing called domains and you should use it because of this or whatever, right? And the fact of the matter is that it's really going to take help kind of going and doing that ourselves. Kind of like the community goal that we have for Queens where we're having projects move their default policies into code. We can document it, we can tell people how to do it, we can give them examples like Keystone's done it, Nova's done it, other projects have started doing it. But it's not really going to get done until you kind of go make that investment in that project and kind of close that gap, like and actually go contribute the code yourself. And a lot of the issues, that brings up a good point, because like a lot of the issues that we're facing are cross-project things at this point. Like we're left with the hard problems, and the hard problems are things that are going to be spanning multiple projects. So that investment's going to be, like, yeah, I'm a Keystone developer, but I need to spend a significant amount of time this release making sure that the thing that Keystone is emitting is being used properly, and the people that are incorporating that into their service understand what that means for them. So yeah, it's going to be a lot of cross-project stuff, and in order to get those things adopted, like system scope or domain support, like we need to make sure that we're kind of addressing that at the forefront and getting involved with those services and I guess that'll probably be done at a more core service basis initially, like, making sure that we're doing that properly with Nova, Glance, Neutron, Cinder, not saying that we shouldn't be doing that with the other projects, but kind of getting in, helping them, and then propagating that out and things like that.
what's the kind of time scale for that stuff then? Are these projects like, a cycle behind or like a few cycles behind on this kind of stuff?
I think that depends on the feature. Like we've had domain support in Keystone since V3, and some projects or services don't really know how to understand V3 things, right? So that, that's a thing that's behind. But we want to make it so that we're like with system scoping, like we're implementing it this release. So hopefully, if we carve out enough time next release to kind of help bridge those gaps, we're not having like a 3 or 4 year window between when we do something in Keystone and when it starts getting enforced at the service. I think that's going to be crucial in order for that to happen. For the Queens community goal, I guess that could be a good indicator. It was accepted for Queens, and we're seeing an uptick in people implementing it and moving their policies into code. But we have more tools now to kind of help with that kind of stuff, like project tags and governance things. Community-wide goals that kind of help us move as a group together towards something that's more consistent as a platform. But anything else? Comments, questions, concerns?
Another one else had another question. Microversions, are you guys adopting those?
Yeah, no. We talked about the PTG. We had a great discussion with Sean Dagg, Matt Trenish. We got a few people in the room that know microversions a little bit more than we do. And I think that was a good thing because traditionally I don't think we've really, it was like an educational thing. Like, what are we not getting, right? So there's reasons for us to do it. There's reasons that still kind of concern us. But we really kind of just need somebody to step up and do the work. We're strapped for resources. We have a path forward for it, I guess. But the other thing that we really need to get out of it is, I think it would help a lot of people if we had a list of things that we're going to go fix once we have that support. Like, doing work just to do work is, I mean, we don't have the resources for that, but
I was just curious.
like it helps people justify, when you can say like, all right, well, if we do this and we implement this support, we're going to be able to cross these things off of our list. And so that's actually one of our goals in our roadmap for Queens, is to come up with that list and make sure that we have that formally documented somewhere, so that we don't keep losing that context every time we bring up the microversion conversation. But
Yeah, for what it's worth, Keystone is the one thing. It's so important, we should not be like,
yeah.
we're not doing it twice.
Yeah, and there's like, fierce sides on both sides of the camp there. So, any other comments, questions? Go ahead.
So I'm a few versions behind when I'm running, so this may be a long sentence answer question. But the thing that I crave is the ability to give a user the right to modify rules within a tenant on rules universally. And the last one of these I was at when I asked that question across the whole big discussion. Is that a thing that's now supported, or is that a thing that's addressed by the system?
It's not addressed directly, but it helps us move towards that if we wanted to do that in Keystone eventually. We do have something called domain roles in Keystone.
Not the domain. I haven't heard, but domain.
Right. Yeah, so it would be like giving, if you sign up for AWS, right, like you have the ability to create and modify policies, and then you can assign those policies to your users, and it's all up to you as the account owner of that specific account. And domain-specific roles are kind of one half of that equation for if we wanted to do something similar in Keystone. The other half would be like the management of it, because when you modify policies and roles, the other part is that you actually need to redeploy the service. And so that's kind of where I was getting with like the HTTP check, because that's essentially centralized policy enforcement without it having to be centralized in Keystone. But that would move us in the direction that it sounds like you've already gone. Yeah, it's all up here, right? Yep. Any other questions? Cool. Well, thanks for coming. And if you have any questions that you think of later, we'll be around. So feel free to come find one of us if you want to talk about anything that we've addressed here. Thank you.
Thank you.